Welcome everybody to another episode of Talking Teaching with Criminologists, brought to you distally, I suppose, by the British Society of Criminology's Learning and Teaching Network, and brought to you approximately by me, John Shute, at the University of Manchester, and my colleague.
I'm Helen Nichols at the University of Hull.
In a very ethereal background and setting, as you can see. This week, we'll be talking about bringing practitioners, criminal justice practitioners, into the classroom, how we do that well, and what the benefits are. And I'm delighted to welcome our guest this time, which is Dr. Carol Robinson. Who is Dr. Carol Robinson, I should say, from the Department of Sociology at the University of York. Hello, Carol. Lovely to have you here.
Hi, John. Lovely to be here.
Great. Excellent. And we be very interested to hear about the course unit that you direct, and to compare notes, as I've done something similar, as I'm sure a number of our listeners have. Okay, well, let's start then. Could you just tell us a little bit, Carol, about your background, your teaching, research interests, how they dovetail, how you came to be working on this particular course unit?
Sure. I'm a lecturer in criminology based in the sociology department at the University of York, and I've been a lecturer for about 4 years now. So prior to that, I was part of a prison chaplaincy team offering pastoral care, and I did that for around about 9 years, mostly working in the high security estate, so with male prisoners. And as that kind of progressed, there was a point when I had a little bit more time and a lot of questions, and that led me to do an MA in criminology, which fairly soon became clear was going to then become a PhD in criminology, and kind of led me to stop my work in prison and become a lecturer at the university, as I say, about 4 years ago. So my PhD was looking at what happens when someone's dying in prison from natural causes, and again, something that really sort of stemmed out of my work in the prison service. Now I teach mostly undergraduates and postgraduate students, postgraduate taught students, particularly third years. So I think that's level 6 in new money. We're still in kind of old terminology. And I teach quite a bit of theory, which is rather ironic because that was the thing I really struggled with when I was doing my master's and indeed my PhD to some extent. But I've come to really enjoy theory and really like teaching it. So my role is a teaching and scholarship one, and I've got a particular interest in how we teach theory, what we think we're doing when we teach theory. I've also got quite a lot of involvement in helping early careers teachers. So I'm the graduate teaching coordinator for my department. I'm very interested in how we foster people at that early career stage. And I've got an interest in making those connections between the classroom and the criminal justice system on a human, personal level as well.
Wonderful. And you know, I become aware of your book, Dying in Prison, which I guess grew out of the PhD, yeah. Which, you know, is another podcast, but I would love to talk about in much more depth, because I'm very interested in death studies myself, though it's generally been in post-conflict situations that I've been interested in, but hugely interesting that in itself. But yeah, we'll keep it, I guess, in this pod to the practitioner-based aspect of it. Super. Helen, do you want to come in and there and unpick some more of that unit?
And I'm glad you kept us on track there, John, because there's just so much there that we could make this podcast into, that we have to be very strict with ourselves. But I think that's one of the reasons we were so keen to do this podcast with you, Carol, was because of your interest in theory, and I suppose we're always interested in interrogating how we actually bring theory to life in the classroom in a way that students can be excited about and engaged with, and I suppose a combination of your approach plus your experiences and your background have of course brought you to this podcast to talk to us more about how you teach theory and how you make that so effective. So I wondered if you could just tell us a bit about the specific module that you're going to be talking to us about today, please.
Yeah, sure, Helen. So this is an optional module for our third year undergraduates. It's been running since spring 2021, which is not necessarily a great time to have started a new module, but there you go. That's that thing that I understand we don't mention on this podcast, that I won't mention the P word at all. And it's a module that I was asked to set up to increase the optionality that was available to our criminology students, although in practice it's open to students on other pathways with us, and it's quite popular with students who are taking different programs. It's often their kind of chance to do a little bit of criminology. And it was something that I presented at interview because I knew that I wanted a module that looked at working in the criminal justice system, that there were lots of interesting issues and ideas there that we didn't necessarily explore in programs as much as we might do. So there's a sort of soft focus on employability. So not necessarily looking at the skills development that we often think about when we talk about employability, but thinking about encouraging students to reflect on what the world of work is like and how they might understand that world of work by using sociological and criminological concepts and theories. So it's very much about trying to understand that experience of working in the criminal justice system, pulling in those kind of concepts and theories that we as criminologists and criminologists from a sociological background have.
And I think, you know, that's kind of a golden ticket, isn't it? Because you're tackling the challenge of teaching theory while also tackling the growing challenge now of embedding employability into the curriculum in a meaningful way. So bringing the two things together, I think, is really novel and really interesting. In relation to how you deliver your teaching, have you got preferences on teaching delivery methods? Have you got methods that you find particularly effective in your experience?
So for this module, the biggie is those guest speakers. So there's a kind of introductory week in which we kind of look briefly at the concepts and ideas that are going to come up during the course of the module, so that they're kind of not new to students. Often it's a bit of kind of refreshing what they might have studied before, but it's kind of reframing and thinking about it in terms of the sociology of work. And some of those big ideas like discretion and accountability and managerialism that we talk about a lot when we think about criminal justice system work as opposed to other sorts of work. And it's then from kind of then on, it's mostly a flipped classroom approach. So that I've got a pre-recorded lecture that the students are listening to give them some background and give them some context before the guest speaker comes in, so that they kind of have a sense of what they might expect, but have some sort of information to help them understand the context of what the guest is talking about. And we look at a different occupation, a different kind of professional group week by week for the rest of the module. That's the kind of structure of it. And when the guest speaker comes in, I interview them. I'm probably not as hard and mean as you two are, but I interview them rather than have them giving a presentation, so that we can very much keep the focus on how they came to do that job, what they like about the job, what's challenging or difficult in the job, where they think it's going. Rather than getting them to give any kind of standard presentation about, you know, working in that sector, keeping it more personal and more immediate, and then giving the students a chance to ask questions as well. So I'm the kind of warm-up act to their questions.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And before I pass over to John, just to ask a few more questions about the actual setting up and development of the module, I wondered if you could give us an example of how you connect a theory to a particular profession. So maybe an example of 1 week on this module and how those two things come together.
Yeah. So the policing week is the one that I kind of foreground looking at discretion as a kind of concept. There's a kind of obvious link there, so I kind of just go for that. The students have readings about the use of discretion, and so they've got a reading on pro-arrester policies around intimate partner abuse. And inevitably, I never set it up this way, but the guest speakers always seem to make some reference to the kind of theory that I'm foregrounding that week. So invariably, the speaker will come in, they'll talk about their experience, there'll be questions, and something will come up which talks which has them talking about this use of discretion in a very practical, hands-on sort of a way. And if it hasn't been picked up by the students, I've then got a seminar after this session with a guest speaker in which we can reflect back on what they've heard, and I can kind of pull those threads together for them a bit. So it often feels like it's a very natural way of looking at theory. I think the students often don't realise how much theory they've looked at that week because it's come into the conversation and because it's been so applied to the real world. I think it's very much one of those things that brings theory alive for students, makes it feel like it's relevant when they see it as having this kind of immediate influence and impact on someone's daily job and the ways that we as criminologists might think about them doing their daily job.
Yeah, and I suppose it's a much more organic way, isn't it, of allowing theory to present itself to the students as opposed to us presenting it to them and trying to convince them this is applicable for all these different reasons in these different scenarios. So, you know, flipping that process and allowing it to emerge and allowing the students to identify that for themselves is really interesting, and I suppose really important at the same time, in order for them to be able to see the value in these concepts and ideas, because they're making those connections, as I said, in a much more natural and organic way as opposed to kind of more didactic delivery. It sounds great. I'm going to pass back over to John, but there might be other stuff that I want to ask you later as well. But yeah, just over to John about setting up the module.
Yeah, thanks very much, Helen. Just hearing you speak there, Carol, it's made me reflect on when I used to direct. It's a year 2 option, and I noticed yours is an option 2 in the 3rd year. But sometimes I think probably we all think about this at times with options. You know, we wish they were all compulsory because they're quite important and we're quite proud of them. But I was just thinking, hearing you there talk about it and how. There's that idea of, I suppose, like stealth theory, where it inevitably becomes part of what you talk about in the application. But also, I guess, the 3 legs to the milking stool in criminology, aren't there? When we teach it, there's theory, there's also methods, and then there's sort of real world applications. And I've also always felt also that there's an opportunity for us to talk about methods and a whole range of different types of issues in the unit that we have at Manchester. Well, we have about the latter half of the unit is, say, 5 speakers, but the first half of the unit, we talk a lot there about how criminology, or whether criminology and its research products can find its way into policy and practice. So there's all that stuff about the politics of evidence and the conditions under which it might be taken up and conditions under which it is not, and evidencing that and so forth. And so one thing that our speakers often talk about, I try to get them to talk about, that it doesn't always produce the sort of the results that you might expect, is the extent to which their practice has been influenced by evidence of a criminological nature, as it were, the extent to which we work together with academics. So there's lots of things, lots of angles that one can bring to this, but as you say, at the heart of it is this idea of just the vividness and the narrative strength, the stories of everyday practitioner life, the pressures there, and also I've found that inevitably when you have big natural experiments, if you can call it that, of say COVID, you get a very proximate and handle on how this is affecting practice at a particular point in time. So I think it's got so many benefits, so much richness to it. But instead of me talking about myself, let's bring it back to you, Carol, and let's talk about something that I found challenging as well as very, very rewarding, which is the whole business of setting up those contacts, maintaining those contacts over time and so forth. So how did you go about sort of creating this unit? How did you go about trying to find local practitioners? How did you persuade them to take part, and what are the issues there?
I used quite a few different approaches, if I'm honest here. So some of it was people I knew, because I'd worked in the prison service. I knew there was people there who would be good in that context, because it's not necessarily for everybody to be thrown in front of the lions of 3rd year undergraduates. So I approached some of my former colleagues. in my first year of working at the University of York, I had a police inspector in one of my master's groups. And I spoke to him when I was kind of thinking about this course and kind of setting up the module. And he was quite interested, and he gave me the names of a couple of his colleagues who he thought would be interested. Indeed, they both were. I had to polish up my LinkedIn profile to an extent that I just, not really bothered with LinkedIn, but actually LinkedIn was really useful in terms of contacting York alumni. So the local alumni office helped. And I think it perhaps helped that I had this background, both working for HMPPS and in the university. So I kind of fitted into kind of both contexts. And that perhaps gave a bit of credibility that people knew that they weren't going to get a kind of hostile approach from me. And I mean, the people I've approached have all said yes. They've all been very willing to be involved year on year, and sometimes when people have moved on, they've then kind of passed me on to one of their colleagues to kind of take over the job from them. I think I did one bit of completely cold calling. So somebody comes in from the voluntary sector, and I identified an organisation that I thought would have the kind of work that they were doing. I thought would be interesting to our students. And so I just called them up and asked, and they were very positive, and they put me on to somebody who they thought was the perfect person to come in, who turned out to be somebody that I knew from my previous role anyway. So there was a kind of nice kind of circle there. So yeah, it's nice. It's easier, I think, working with people year on year, but it's also a good opportunity to get to know other people and bring in other contacts. And it's lovely having that support external to the university for what's happening in the classroom. The practicalities are sometimes a bit challenging, and particularly when a prison inspection gets called at 2 weeks' notice, and that's the governor you've got lined up suddenly having to give their apologies. And during the thing we're not talking about, obviously illness was a factor. And we started off pre-recording, and then we moved into the classroom. And actually, I think in the classroom builds that better relationship anyway. Yeah, that it is tempting. And with the barrister, we're still pre-recording that because she just doesn't have the time. So there's a kind of practical limitation there. Her calendar's not her own, and she doesn't have the time to come up to York and do that interview. So that's the one I think is always going to have to stay as a pre-recorded interview and then written Q&A. But yeah, I think it surprised me sometimes how nervous guest speakers can be, and it works well when it's not their first time. It works well when we get to sit down and have coffee beforehand and just give them a chance to look at the room they're going to be teaching in and just arrive and feel settled before the interview starts. But it's not been as complex in terms of the practicalities as you might imagine.
Sure. At the perhaps the most obvious sort of practical issue I always encountered was just diary commitments. I think very busy people, sometimes coming in from around the region in the northwest where we're based, but generally find, as you say, that people are delighted to come in. It's also, I don't know, especially the first time they do it, something a bit different and break from the routine, I suppose, as well. But I think that sort of idea of care and going for a coffee beforehand and helping prepare people is something that I also found worked very well. I like your emphasis on Q&A, which can take away some of the fear of presentation, can't it? And it is interesting, when you take, sometimes quite senior people who you might expect to be, very confident, and indeed are very confident in particular contexts, adjusting to their expectations of the classroom. I think, I mean, I find. Sorry.
I was going to say that I think that Q&A helps keep it more about the experiences of work and less. I mean, particularly for the voluntary sector organisation, they're so used to having to be just kind of promoting what they're doing, fundraising, that's their kind of default.
Yes.
And it's interesting, but it's not actually what I'm trying to get at on this module. So I think that interview and Q&A is an approach that's worked really well. And it means they've got no prep to do. So I'm asking them to give up some travel time and some time to meet with the students, but I'm not asking them to give any pre-thought to it. I always send through the questions in advance, but they don't need to produce slides or check their timings right. They can just turn up and talk to kind of through those questions with me. That's all they have to do.
And how do you try to maximize student engagement? I mean, we've had part of the preparation was to think about questions and to pre-prepare those and so forth. But I always found that the sessions were inevitably so rich in sort of narrative and example that the students were also, as indeed was I, very happy to listen enthralled. So that could be a bit more one way. So how have you tried to build in student engagement then?
Are you thinking in terms of engagement in terms of being actually there, or engagement
in the session?
in interact?
In the session, do you have students asking questions?
Yeah. So we start off with me asking some questions, and then have a small break so that students can then reflect in small groups on what they've just heard and come up with questions. And then very much I'm kind of chairing the Q&A from them. And it's notable that quite often it might seem like it's a small handful of students asking the questions, but I've realised that because they've had the time in small groups to talk about questions, often they're presenting a question that's come on behalf of the small group they were with. And some students come with particular things they're interested in. There's a particular career path they're interested in. They may have very precise, detailed questions that they've already kind of brought with them. And other times they're clearly just reflecting on what they've heard. Some of my favourite questions are when they're effectively summarising theory to then ask the question back of the guest speaker. So I'm thinking about a prison officer coming in and talking about her experiences, and somebody saying, well, are you ever afraid? And if you are afraid, can you show it? And if you can't show it, what are you doing to hide that? And I'm thinking, okay, we've just got emotional labour. Clearly that student has got the literature on emotional labour this week and is using that to kind of frame her question back to the prison officer. So, I mean, that's a lovely way of knowing that the theories and the concepts are actually hitting home, but the kind of students are kind of owning them enough to then be forming their question around it and kind of feeding the theory back to the guest speaker. It's lovely when that happens.
Absolutely. That's a really nice example.
Yeah, it definitely shows that they're engaged in it. In terms of attendance, I do a bit of pleading to start with. I do a certain amount of actually, this person's given up their time. They're really busy. Please come. And so usually, attendance the first week of any module, in my experience, is usually better than the kind of good new module, new resolutions. But actually, the guest speakers then hook them in because it's so interesting having that interaction that the actual attendance is pretty good, really.
I find that too, absolutely. I also thought, your point about sort of setting up the links, but also how those links evolve dynamically over time, where you get the same speakers suggesting other angles or other people to come in. So we started off, I think, with prison, probation, police, but then that sort of and youth justice, but then we started to get local victim-oriented or crime-oriented in a very loose sense blogs that would come in. We had a fraud and organised crime investor come in through colleagues' links in that general area. So it's sort of a live thing, and there is development year on year, I think, which is which again allows you to sort of give a greater breadth, I think, of experience. But also, that sense of the current context, I think, as well. So it's wonderful. What I don't know if you evaluate this formally, but what do the speakers make of the experience, do you think?
They're mostly very positive enough that they come back. I do remember one saying that actually she was more scared coming to talk to the students than she was going to work in a high security prison, which was very interesting. She was brilliant, but this is something that I think is outside of the comfort zone of some people who work in the criminal justice system. And there are bits of the criminal justice system that at different times come in for some flack in the media. And I think that can sometimes be at the back of people's minds when they come to talk to students. Are they going to get a hostile reception here? But they don't, because I think what they're saying is just so interesting. But I think they do sometimes come with a certain amount of kind of trepidation about, am I going to have to be defending my organisation? But they've all been very positive about the experience afterwards. And I think they've often, some of the questions are quite interesting. And most people in my experience like talking about their work. These are people who've chosen to spend large chunks of their lives doing something, and they've got an audience who want them to keep talking about it. And I think that's quite a positive experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, that's wonderful. The many more questions I could ask there, or observations I could make, Carol, but that was wonderful. Mindful of time, I'll hand back over to Helen to move us on. Thanks very much.
Done. Thank you. Yeah, and I suppose this ties in really nicely with the previous question, which was what the speakers make of the experience, and the natural question is, okay, so what do students think of this? And I think in particular, how do they feel about the format? So I can imagine having the Q&A format is obviously very different to asking someone to just come in and do a guest talk. And while a guest speaker is kind of enticing, they're very used to a lecture style format. So do they like the fact that it's Q&A, that they can see you interacting with the speaker? And what are some of the key takeaways that students have given you about the module?
They seem very positive about it. It is very different to a lot of the modules that they would have had kind of so far in their programs. Even that element of the flipped classroom is not something pre-pandemic, sorry I said it, we use very much at York at all. So the feedback tends to highlight the flipped classroom aspect almost as much as it has highlighted the guest speaker. Though there is, there's more emphasis on the guest speaker. They're very definitely appreciative of the time that's given up. They do, some of them do comment on that kind of appreciating that it does take some organising to do this. But their feedback suggests that they found it a very rich experience, that they found it a very kind of immediate experience. That kind of gap between theory and the real world has been really bridged for them. And they do give feedback that suggests that they've thought about things differently as a result of having the guest speakers come in. And I guess it's kind of what you're trying to achieve, I guess, in any teaching and learning setting. But they're kind of more obviously noticing that that's happened because of the format that they've gone through in this module with those guest speakers. And they were kind of, they've got some responsibility with those Q&As. So they've got chance to ask directly what they want. It doesn't have to come through me. Sometimes I sit there thinking, oh, I hope this question is going to be okay, and it is always okay. But it's their choice of the question, and it's the guest speaker's choice of how they respond. And so kind of stepping back out of that for the latter part of the session, I think is a really positive experience for the students, and certainly seems to be something that they appreciate in the feedback that I've had.
Absolutely, and I really think that you can, just from you describing the module and the way that the students interact with it and the ownership they have over those kind of questions, you can almost kind of sense the richness of all of those things combined. Because obviously the students are having an opportunity to interact with people from the sector, do you hear back from students about their career choices, whether any of those sessions have either influenced them towards certain careers or the opposite? Of course, certainly, my own teaching experience about prisons, often the result is, well, I'm never working in a prison. So either way, has there been any influence on students' career choices, both towards and indeed away from?
Definitely, yeah. So negatives first. Away from being a barrister specialising in criminal law, I think the biggest takeaway from that week always is students are saying there's no way I could do that. But once they understand the work-life balance, once their idea that barristers are tremendously well paid is blown apart by somebody who's at a fairly early career stage, who's working long hours, self-employed, with very little security and not a great deal of income. That's the negative side. I think they pretty much come out and going, okay, I thought I might go and do a law conversion course and be a barrister. I think I'm going to reflect on that again. But there have been students go on to be prison officers. A couple of them gone on to work in prisons where I can know people there quite well, and it's been lovely to think, yes, they're going to be a great prison officer, but also I'm really pleased that my former colleagues are going to get to work with them. And there was a young woman recently who was thinking of the police, but at a time when there was rightly a lot of negative coverage of the Met and issues around kind of gender discrimination in the Met. And hearing from a female a police officer in a different police force, asking her those questions about, what it's like to be a woman in that setting, I think was really helpful for her. And she now works in the Met. So there's definitely an influence there. I don't think it necessarily changes someone's career path, but I think it's helpful for them and gives them things to kind of reflect on if they're already thinking, maybe I might work in the criminal justice system somewhere. And sometimes we don't necessarily know what a forensic psychologist does, or in some cases what's done by a probation officer even. And so hearing from those people, I think, opens up new doors. And I can think also of a student who was doing some work with a voluntary sector organisation that was involved with crime issues. And I think kind of hearing from other people in that sector who are making a career out of that sector has influenced her choices too. So I can see kind of cases where there's very strongly a correlation between the module, hearing from those guest speakers, and making future career choices. But I sort of hope that just thinking about these issues and these concepts it does give students extra skills for whatever line of work they find themselves in. And that, the ideas of discretion and emotional labour and marketisation are not just limited to the criminal justice system, and probably do help them think, having that kind of skill set around the sociology of work, knowing those kind of concepts and ideas, probably stands them in good stead wherever they finish up.
I think as well, one of the most valuable things I've found is when you've had a student do a particular module, they've gone into that line of work, and then you have them come back to talk to students about the fact that I studied this module, I'm now in this line of work, and this is how I'm connecting the two. And that happened when I was working at the University of Lincoln. There was a student who did one of my optional prison modules, and he went to work in a prison. He came back and was able to tell the students who were studying that same module, this is how I'm using these concepts and ideas in my day-to-day work. Do you ever get students who have gone into the sector coming back to contribute to the module in the same way that professionals from the sector did when they were a student? So do they then become the guest speakers in some cases?
It is starting to happen, yes.
Wow.
So the program's run for 3 years, so it's not had very long to kind of build up that kind of legacy. But last year there was a speaker in who had just finished her master's with us and was now a trainee probation officer. But she'd done her undergrad with us as well, so she was able to kind of talk about the ways in which her program had contributed towards the work that she's now doing. And certainly a couple of people who've done this particular module who are now working in the criminal justice system have said that they would be willing to come back. I kind of feel I'm a little bit torn on that. I want to give them time to get their feet under the table and settled into their new role before I ask them back into the classroom. But I will certainly be following those leads up, because I think it is helpful for students to see kind of where they might be in 2 or 3 years. And yeah, so I think if we can find a way of doing that appropriately, it'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think tying in the alumni, whether it's separate to or included in the module, is a great way for students to kind of envision the future and think about, as you say, where they might want to be. So it sounds fantastic. John, do you have any further questions that you would like to ask Carol?
I mean, just starting off there by resonating with the bringing in the alumni people who are training, and I think that brings a really sort of important and interesting sort of perspective, really, because I don't know, when you bring a representative of any given profession, and you're always sampling, aren't you? I mean, there are many different roles and many different levels of seniority. So I think to capture that in your overall sample of speakers, but also to get people with recent experience of that particular course that you're teaching on, talking about training and their expectations versus realities and so forth, I think is just great. I just wanted to know where you are with the unit, Carol. I mean, going forward, I mean, are you happy with where it is, and then it will just sort of naturally evolve and it has its place? Or is there particular places that you'd like to take it? Because it strikes me that it's something that we do quite defensively, because it's a very rich experience for everybody. For undergrads, it's not something that often finds its way, or we're able to find space for at postgrad, at master's sort of level, though indeed we may have practitioners on those master's subjects. So is there any way you'd like to take this on, or are you happy with it as it is now?
I don't know about you, but I think I'm rarely entirely happy with a module. I'm always thinking about how it needs tweaking and changing and improving. There's a couple of changes that I think that are happening with this module. So we've switched at York from 3 terms to teaching in 2 semesters. We're still getting our head around that. I think this is week 2 of that. It's going well so far, but that's given us a chance to think about kind of all of our modules, and one of the big changes for us is we're doing much more team teaching. Now, at the moment, this module isn't team taught, it relies on me. And partly that's because there's so many moving parts. It needs to be quite flexible. So you might be thinking in week 5, we've got prison officers coming, and in week 6, we've got police officers coming. And then you get to week 3 and you discover that's not going to work in their diaries anymore. So there's a certain kind of, there's just a lot of moving parts on a module like this. But one of the things I do want to do is find a way of making it work as team teaching. That I don't think it needs, it doesn't need me in the classroom every time. And I think what we're finding with our other modules is that team teaching adds some resilience in, but it also adds a whole range of different perspectives and ways of thinking about things that I think are really enriching for students. So that's the first thing. And then with the switched 2 semesters, we're also introducing dip down and dip up modules. Dip up doesn't really work as a metaphor. We haven't found a better way of saying it. But options for students so if a module is regarded as a 3rd year option, what are the circumstances in which maybe a 2nd year could take it as an option? And really as a way of increasing the optionality for our students. So this module and one other are going to be dip up modules for this academic year. And we're going to be looking at ways of evaluating that experience for the students, thinking about what impact that might have on assessment, interested in how that affects confidence and engagement if you're taking a module where most of the cohort are perhaps the year above you. So yeah, that's a little bit of an experiment for us. We're using this module and one other, as I say. We're going to be evaluating how that is from all angles. But I think the module lends itself quite well to that approach. So I'm interested to see how that works. It then, at the moment, our master's program in criminology and social research doesn't have optionality. So this would have to be this kind of approach needs to be incorporated into a whole kind of core module there. There isn't that option of dipping down in the same way into a kind of an undergraduate module for our postgraduate students. We do have postgraduate students who have worked in the criminal justice system, in the Ministry of Justice even, so who bring those experiences into the classroom. And I think that's really enriching if they're willing to kind of blur that boundary between their student identity and their practitioner identity, then it can be very enriching. But I've been clear to date that first and foremost they're there as a student, and so it's up to them to make that kind of blurring. It's not up to me as the lecturer to kind of call on them to do it. I don't know whether that's something that you would agree with, or whether that's just my own sort of sense there.
I think it is definitely important to support the student in understanding their primary purpose for being in that scenario. and reminding them that you're here as a student first. So I would agree with that approach, but offering the opportunity for them to give insight from their own professional experiences is also great, because as you mentioned earlier, the speakers often are keen to talk about their own experiences. And we know that students who have professional backgrounds in criminal justice are often equally as keen. So I think it's really good that you actually set that tone first and say you're a student first, but if you want to engage in this way, then obviously that's fantastic, but that it isn't required. John, I don't know if you...
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, you know, the practitioners who are taking a master's, their experiences generally come out naturally, I suppose, in class discussions anyway, to a great extent. And indeed, the discussions, the probably more important discussions that happen outside the classroom. I think one thing we do is, I mean, I was so enthusiastic about the quality of what we were producing, and there's various spin-offs. I mean, because there was the focus of talking about the relationship between criminology and evidence and policy and practice, then I also interviewed some of my colleagues and other people about their experiences of working in criminal justice with practitioners. So one thing that we did, and again, this COVID sort of forced it in a way that ultimately became beneficial, was to record everything, obviously with everybody's consent, and to make those videos more broadly available. So we had people outside the unit, people in the third year, people in masters classes, watching these videos for general entertainment and information, but also for their own career purposes. Because of course, at masters not only got practitioners, but we did have a fair contingent of people who've stepped into criminology directly from undergrad. So they're still very much thinking about employability issues themselves and benefiting the same ways as the undergraduates. But I think the last thing I wanted to say, Carol, this is well done for creating this from scratch. It sounds it's a demanding thing to set up and to keep going, but I think the benefits are really manifest for everybody. Really, it's enjoyable to do, isn't it? It really is quite enjoyable to do.
Yeah.
So
I think it's worth acknowledging our practical challenges to it, but it's hugely rewarding and enjoyable to do, and I'm really pleased that I've done it.
Great, wonderful. Well, thanks ever so much for today. And if there isn't anything more, Helen.
No, that's it. I mean, I could ask loads more questions, especially given your research area and your book, but we'll save that for a different time. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Carol. And it's been really interesting to hear about your module, and definitely would like to catch up with you about it again in the future.
Lovely. Thank you both very much. Thank you.